You're listening to WCAT Radio, your home for authentic Catholic programming.
Welcome to The Open Door, a show based on the words in Revelation, "I have left an open door before you, which no one can close." This is WCAT Radio's longest-running show, which opened the door to the radio station in October 2016. It's currently offered by Jim Hanink, Mario Ramos Reyes and friends, and remains open to the love of God in its call to build a culture of life and a just social order through the panel's discussion of the Catholic social teaching principles of solidarity, subsidiarity, and economic democracy. The Open Door also explores nonviolence, distributism, and communitarianism. So join us at the Open Door, where you too can be part of the conversation.
Welcome to the Open Door. Jim Hanink here with fellow panelists Mario Ramos Reyes and Christopher Zender. Today we'll pick up with a 2,500-year-old conversation, except it's a 25-year young conversation as we join it. Its participants want to better understand that which is. Are material things the whole of reality? And if so, can we get past how they appear to us? Or are there minds as well as matter? And what the dickens are we to make of ourselves? At the end of the day, and sometimes at its beginning, our politics, art, and ethics converge in what we take reality to be. Our special guest is Stephen Alexander Beach, the author of The Drama of Metaphysics, an exploration into the psychological power of worldviews, from En route Books and Media, just this year. As always, we begin in prayer. Come, O Holy Spirit, fill the hearts of your faithful, and enkindle in them the fire of your love. Send forth your Spirit, and they shall be created, and you shall renew the face of the earth. O God, who has taught the hearts of the faithful by the light of the Holy Spirit, grant that by the gift of the same Spirit, we may be always truly wise and ever rejoice in his consolation. Through Christ our Lord. Amen. Stephen, if we may, could you begin by telling us a bit about yourself and your background?
Absolutely, Jim. Thank you for having me here this morning. So I'm from Charleston, South Carolina. This is where I was born and have grown up. And I live here now with my wife, Juliana, and I work at the local Catholic high school teaching theology and philosophy. On the side, I also run a philosophy blog called The Great Perennial Questions. I was formed in my early 20s as a seminarian. I spent 4 years in seminary, and that's where I really encountered philosophy for the first time and kind of fell in love with it, honestly. So I went through Seton Hall University. I went to St. Thomas University in Houston, and then most recently just graduated from Holy Apostles College and Seminary. So philosophy and theology, it's just my passion. I love working with young people and just reading, blogging, learning, all that type of stuff.
Well, I'm just going to butt in for 1 minute. You know John Hittinger?
So I heard the name, but I wasn't able to take a class with him.
Oh, well, you lucky rascal. You managed to dodge the bullet. That's wonderful. Wonderful.
Jeez.
Oh, all right. Mario, you want to take us a little bit ahead?
Well, I was struck by the title of your book. Unfortunately, I haven't read yet, even though probably Sebastian is going to require me to read. So the word drama, you use the word drama of metaphysics. I never heard about this word you combine with metaphysics. Why do you think metaphysics is a drama? It's a dramatic effort or task.
Yeah, at first you might think of metaphysics as like just very dry, very academic, abstract. But in all honesty, I would say it is dramatic, and history has been a reflection of how we think about metaphysics. So it's like the foundation of a house. Whatever that foundation you lay, that's going to affect every other floor and aspect of that house. If it's a weak foundation, it could collapse. If it's a strong foundation, it might stand firm. Another way to think about it is a common metaphor people use of a stream. So if culture is downstream from politics, metaphysics I would put at the head of the stream. Everything kind of flows from that down into politics, down into culture, down into everyday life. So even if people don't realize it, I think it is kind of dramatic when you look at how these ideas have oscillated from century to century and how that affects the way people live.
So let's put it in this way. If politics is something, an activity, or we can go further than that build a common good, then behind that there is an assumption, a metaphysical assumption. And today we are witnessing not a metaphysic, rather than a lack of metaphysics, which show how we live. Am I correct in my assessment?
Yeah, so the 20th century is very dramatic, and that's
21st.
kind of what and the 21st. That's what I kind of focus on in my book. This shift away from what I call metaphysical theism to ideologies of materialism, and that shift is where all the drama takes place, because a worldview or metaphysics is all encompassing. So that means if that changes, we have to change how we think about, as Jim mentioned, politics, art, the way we interact with our neighbor, economics, everything really. So yes, I think that's the drama right now, is we're in the age of materialistic ideologies, and not just in the sense of like materialism, like consuming things, but in a philosophical sense of we reject any notion that there's more to life in the physical realm.
Thank you.
Christopher, what do you say?
Well, I have a question. When the town I used to live in, California, had a bookstore. It was called Windows of Light. It was a New Age bookstore. And they used the term metaphysics too. I suspect that when you use the term metaphysics and they use the term metaphysics, you're talking about different things. I don't know if you bring crystals into this at all. But so I'm curious, what is metaphysics? Because I think a lot of people we use the term. We think we all understand what we're talking about, but other people don't understand what they're talking about, nor do they understand the parameters of the word. What is it, and what does it include?
Yeah, so it was a word that was first formalized by Aristotle, and the way he defined it was a study of the ultimate causes or an origin of everything else. So when we're talking about metaphysics, we're talking about ultimate realities, that from which everything else flows or is generated. And so in a philosophical sense, it definitely has a more rigorous meaning in that it's trying to study what's the origin of the universe, what's the origin of being, why does something exist and not nothing. In the New Age sense, I think it kind of gets more into the like occult, like sort of fringe theories about, still on the same topic, where everything came from, but less in like a rational or rigorous sense, more in like I don't know what the right word is, like it's occult or speculative or fringe sense. if that helps. So metaphysics deals with the origin of things, also the identity of things. Okay, what is the core of something's identity? What it is? Is it its physical parts, or is it the sort of the essence that we perceive with our mind? And then also, finally, with our ultimate purpose, right? Where are we going? What are we doing here? How should I be living my life? So a simple way to think about it is just, the deepest questions about our origin, our identity, and our purpose.
So if there's a metaphysics, there must be a physics.
Yes.
And what is the relationship between metaphysics and physics? And you seem to be bringing in ethics in here too. So how does that all fit in?
Sure. Yeah. So physics is sort of the beginning of philosophical investigation, in that it's the study of nature, right? We begin from our human perspective of looking at the world and trying to understand like things that we deal with, like why is everything changing, but at the same time things also stay the same. Like Heraclitus's river, the river's always moving, it's always changed, it's always different, but we talk about it as the same thing. Nature is full of this dichotomy of changing, but also retaining its identity. And so the first kind of physical question is, what is nature made up of? And of course, you have the pre-Socratics talking about things being made up of water or fire or earth, or the combination of these elements. So physics is kind of the beginning. And then once you probe more into that, it kind of naturally leads you to metaphysics. Okay, if everything is made of water or earth or this, okay, can we take that a step further? What is the origin of that? And what is the origin of that? And what is the origin of that? Until you reach an ultimate cause. And that's when you're talking about being as such with metaphysics. So they're really connected. It's just kind of like maybe the difference between starting out, trying to understand the world, and then ultimately reaching a conclusion as best you can. And then the connection with ethics is, well, you can't, I don't think, really separate the human person and our sort of existential experience of living from these other metaphysical questions. So sometimes when we study it, we tend to segregate them. But one of the people I focus on my book, Jose Ortega y Gasset, is a 20th century Spanish existentialist philosopher. He makes the point very clear that as a human being, we can't really even act without a metaphysic, right? Because life is so complex. If there's too much of the unknown, too much complexity, we're sort of frozen. We don't know where to go, what to do. He talks about life being disorientation at its beginning. We have this disparate set of experiences, but then as a human, we're longing to try to unite those and bring them together. And so once we do that with metaphysics, then like the ethics part becomes very clear.
So basically with physics, we start out as Aristotle said, we start with sense knowledge, right? We go from sense knowledge to understand our sense, what our sense knowledge presents us. At a certain point, we have to reach a point where we're going beyond what we can actually sense and what we can understand immediately by what we sense.
Right. And
that becomes metaphysics. So can we even speak? Because everybody makes some assumption after the physics level. I think everybody engages in the physics level to some degree. But we always come to the end of that, and we always make some assumption beyond the physics level. Isn't even if there's a denial of that there's anything beyond the physical, beyond the material, isn't that in itself a metaphysics?
Yes. Okay. And I think that's a great observation. And I wanted to introduce something, what I call the problem of incomplete information. So I think sometimes atheists try to present us believers or metaphysical theists or whatever as, okay, we have the assumptions that we're working with, that God exists, that we have a soul, X, Y, or Z, and that they're the ones who don't have any assumptions. Okay, they just have science. But when you probe a little bit deeper, you begin to see that atheism is just as much a faith, or it has axiomatic presuppositions that can't be proven, just as Christianity. And so, the problem of incomplete information So imagine you have a set of points. Okay, here's point 1 and here's point 10. Okay, and you're confident about knowing point 1 and point 10, but you don't know points 2 through 9. You don't know how 1 gets to 10. Okay, so what do? Like I mentioned before, as humans, we want to complete the picture. Okay, but we don't know, let's say if these were just a line and a set of points, if the line goes up and comes down to 10, maybe the line goes down and then comes up to 10, maybe it's a zigzag. Okay, so we know 1 and 10, we have to make some presuppositions to fill in how we get from 1 to 10. And so in a lot of ways, that's what a worldview is. We know some things about reality, but there's a lot of things we don't know. And so we want a coherent view of the whole picture. And so the materialist says, well, all there is matter and energy. Okay, you can't prove that. You definitely can't prove it scientifically. Okay, but they work off that assumption. Okay, and so the way they explain point 1 to 10 is taking a given, all that exists is matter. Now, I ran into this problem. So a few years ago, I got involved with the Discovery Institute in Seattle. I don't know if you're familiar with them, but it's a group of scientists and philosophers that work off the simple presupposition that the universe has an intelligent design behind it, or there's an intelligence or design in the way things work. Very, very simple. So it brings in all different types of people, but that's kind of the premise that they work with. And so I went out there one summer to participate in a summer seminar. And it's very interesting. A lot of these questions of evolution face the same problem. So we found this fossil, okay, or we know this about a species, okay, but we don't have anything in between. Okay, so how did this get to this? Well, depending on the presuppositions that you take, okay, if you're a naturalist, a materialist, you're going to say, well, of course, like there is a step-by-step evolution that must have happened to get from here to here. Okay, but you don't necessarily have that proof. All right, that's a conclusion based off your assumption. So that's the problem of incomplete information. I think it goes back to that. And I think they're working off just as much of a faith-based thing as I would argue ours is even less faith-based or less fideistic than theirs is.
Well, if it's Aristotle was engaged in metaphysics, it wasn't faith-based.
Right.
So that would be a question. Is it just is our metaphysics just plausible assumptions that we make in order to explain reality, or is there actually something, use the term scientific in the proper sense, where there's a demonstration where you can actually, as they say, prove, say, the existence of a first being?
Yeah, I think it's some of both. So I like to think about it maybe, okay, so imagine being in a dark room, okay, and you have a candle, and that candle shines a little bit of light around you. Now, over time, more people come into the room with more candles, and so the light begins to grow and the darkness kind of recedes, and you begin to see what's in the room. Now, depending on where you are in that timeline, there still may be some dark corners because you don't have enough light yet to see what's there. And so I would argue that, in the Aristotelian scientific sense, when we come to clear conceptions of things and we have proper formal logic, we can know something with demonstrative surety. But that doesn't mean that we know everything yet. But there are some things that we know very clearly. And I think you would have a really hard time denying something like the principle of causality, for example. Okay, because in denying it, okay, you're denying the connection between any type of rational thought. Even the ideas you're using to deny it, you're denying that they have a causal connection. Okay, a principle of non-contradiction would be the same thing. So there are some truths that are so fundamental that you can't question them without falling into absurdity or self-contradiction. Now, I would argue God's existence is demonstrably necessary. But it's hard sometimes to get people to the point where they can see that.
Mm-hmm. They need physics.
Mario, did you have your hand up there, or were you making a bid at an auction?
No, I have a question, but I at this point, I don't remember exactly. But this is my question. You talk about Ortega. Ortega talk about worlds. We live in a world, in an horizon, so close to what we may call phenomenology. So we begin with certain assumptions about reality, whether you are Aristotelian or you are Cartesian. Both begin from somewhere. And both end in concluding something. Now, if that is the case, then between worlds, there is not a chance that we can even communicate. Because not only our conclusions differ, but also our assumptions differ. And then you get into a world of fragmentation. Now, how can we show this? Look around. If that is the case, I don't know if it is. I'm just trying to describe as exactly as it was. I mean, Ortega taught. Then, if that is the case, worldview somehow represent the synthesis of those assumptions and conclusions. Now, my question is, how then I'm going to engage in a dialogue with someone who not even recognize the principle from which I begin to argue about? And so are then our world incommensurable? And if that is the case, philosophy is worthless.
No, I mean, that's a great observation. And I think probably all of us, when you do apologetics, run into this. I teach, one of my classes I teach at the high schoolers to 11th grade is Catholic morality. And for several years, I would go through these different topics, church teaching on euthanasia, abortion, death penalty, IVF. And it seemed like some people, it didn't matter what I said, would come away with totally different conclusions than I was arguing for in class or that the church taught. And I began to wonder, why is this? One person understands it, the other person completely misinterprets it. And then I began to realize, okay, they're taking what I'm saying and they're running it through their set of presuppositions. And this is the conclusion that they're generating. And so it's a big problem. It's a big problem. And it's like the iceberg analogy, okay? We're arguing oftentimes what we see above the surface and we can't make any progress, okay? Where we really need to be arguing is we need to go deep down as far as we can go and argue about these first principles or first assumptions of philosophy. And only when we do that and we come to some type of agreement are we going to agree about the more specific situations. So an example could be abortion. Okay, we're arguing, the materialists say, okay, it's not a person, it's just a clump of cells. Okay, theists would say, no, okay, all of us are just a clump of cells, so that's all we are. None of us have value, right? There has to be something more. The identity of us, our soul, has to be present. Okay, so I think most people would probably say life is valuable, but depending on whether you see if we have a soul or we're just a clump of cells, you're going to come to a different conclusion. And so we really need to be debating, do we have a soul? Right? And if we do, how do we know? And what are the philosophical arguments for that? And so that was another reason why I felt kind of called to write this book, is maybe for apologetics, we need to start addressing these like really, really foundational issues to make some progress.
Thank you.
Here are a couple, three thoughts. First is just an observation. I think, Stephen, you'll agree that our thought has not crystallized.
What do you mean?
Well, back in the day, Christopher had a friend with a metaphysical bookstore that involved crystals, but Christopher refused to go in. And as a result, we're following his example. Our thoughts have not crystallized. So that's what you're dealing with. Now, another thought, this one I hope is a little bit more substantive. A lot of people would say, well, I don't know about philosophy. I know this, though. I never even took a course in physics. And look here, you're telling me I have to do metaphysics, and that's based on physics, and you can't deny it. Physics is based on math, and I never took Algebra 2, and this whole thing is getting away from me big time. So somebody might say, I don't know, we hang around with a strange group of people on this program. Somebody might say, well, that's all right. I mean, it's great if you do take Algebra 2. And by the way, Plato said no one enters the academy unless he's a geometer. But we're not going to be rigorists like that. Tell you what, you might just have, if you read the right poems and maybe go to the right plays and have some crises in your life, you might just have an intuition of being. And that's as good as physics. And if all you mean by physics is that you have sense experiences, well, okay, that's fine. You have to have sense experiences to read the right poems and participate in the right forms of theater and have some life crises. But what's really crucial is you have an intuition of being. And hang out with us. We'll try to prompt you to have an intuition of being. After all, our own thinking is not yet crystallized. And you're talking about the drama of metaphysics. There's a runaway bestseller in certain circles called Metaphysical Animals. And the metaphysical animals turn out to be philosophers, all women. One is Elizabeth Anscombe, and another is Philippa Foot, and another is Iris Murdoch, and another is Mary Midgley. And they were all deeply involved in a revolt against language, truth, and logic. That is to say, the logical positivism that ran things for such a long period of time. And what they all want to argue is that we're metaphysical animals. We just are. And nonetheless, and this takes us back to what we might call apologetics, Mary Midgley, even though Murdoch and Anscombe were theists and Philippa Foot was open to that, considered it, Mary Midgley said she could never find any reason to believe in God. The question really didn't come up for her, although she knew that the logical positivists had to be wrong and that she freely acknowledged that she was a metaphysical animal, but God just didn't knock on her door, I guess. Any thoughts?
Sure. Maybe first I could start with a quote from Aristotle. If you philosophize, then you philosophize. If you don't philosophize, then you philosophize. Therefore, you philosophize. So the basic thing is, even if you maybe don't feel that depressing draw of some of these questions, or you're not formally a philosopher, haven't studied the physics or the metaphysics, you're still a human. And so by being human, you can't help but be drawn towards these questions and having some type of answer to them. Maybe it's not really a thought out answer. Maybe it's an answer based on practical wisdom or practical experience of how do I deal with people? How do I get through life? How do I find meaning in my life? But nevertheless, everybody has some type of answer. And this is where I think Ortega's work is so beautiful, because he really emphasizes the person behind the philosopher or the scientist or whoever. It's the human condition. We don't like just random experiences because, right, it's disorienting. We don't know who we are, where we've come from, where we're going. And so everybody, I would argue, has put together at least some type of framework to live their life in, even if, like that last lady that you mentioned, doesn't feel that draw towards the question of God. In some lesser sense, she's put together a framework for herself. She has certain rules that she lives by, certain goals that she has. And then I think you mentioned tragedy. I think that's a great point. Sometimes it takes tragedy or an extreme experience or a death or a sickness or whatever to kind of shock people, like an existential shock, waking them up to that, like, hey, maybe I should think about this because I'm going to die, right? Even if I have a good life, even if I'm pretty happy here, my loved one, my spouse is going to die. I'm going to die. And so I don't know. I would still argue everybody's faced with that question, whether they want to admit to it or not, that you have to face it.
So we need to challenge those people.
Yeah, I would think so. Push them a
Especially
little
if they're
bit, right?
high school junior class, we need to challenge those people.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. But death is like, we can ignore death. Okay, we can just say, well, it's just unknown what happens after death. But in a way, I think that's kind of a cop out. We can know things. We know the universe is intelligible. That's why science works. That's why we learn things. That's why we progress. So I usually don't like that answer when people say, well, it's just unknowable. Well, I don't know. I think we can know some things. Principle of non-contradiction seems pretty knowable, right? So let's see what we can know, instead of just kind of pushing the question to the side.
Mario, back to you.
I want to ask something about worldviews, and let me begin with something is happening now, politically speaking. You know, the rise of libertarianism is huge in Latin America now. The influence is everywhere. So libertarians are the star. Now, there is an Argentinian who has a lot of influence in the media and also in digital media, who have claimed that market has to be everywhere. And so he's proposing anarcho-capitalism, anarchism and capitalism. And so he said, well, he's fine with selling body parts in case of you need a transplant. So no more donation, rather than let the market work because the market is more efficient. Okay. But at the same time, he is pro-life. He's citing here and there biblical verses. And so it seems that his view is a blend of the Judeo-Christian tradition, and at the same time is proposing something which seems to me is quite naturalist. So somehow he is proposing two worldviews which in itself seem to be incompatible, but who cares? And so people defend coming from the Judeo-Christian tradition, and then the libertarian on the other side. And so it's a mess. And when you get into the debate and say, hey, hold on, let's see what counts as a human person, and so on and so forth. It seems that this language is completely foreign to them. Now, how then we go about and define what a worldview is, and how compatible are those worldviews if there are examples of them?
Yeah, that's an interesting example. And I might take it to the chapter I wrote on nihilism in the book, and to Nietzsche's work Beyond Good and Evil, because what I think that's really revolutionary about Nietzsche is the idea that truth is simply a value. Okay, you might value logical consistency or abstract truth or coherency, but he would argue you could also just as much value passion and will and desire and bodily gratification. And so a lot of these ideologies or worldviews, Nazism, which I was also talking about in the book, Communism, they don't actually believe that truth is something inherent in things. And so that's, again, why they're materialist philosophies. Everything's in flux. There's no identity, a metaphysical identity or essence to things. And so, well, truth is whatever I form it to be, or I can convince people that it is, or I can start a revolution to have people think that it is. Okay, and so first I would probably go to him and see what he thinks about that. Does he believe that there is a truth, objective truth in things, or is everything totally, malleable to be socially engineered? Now, if he believes that there is a truth in things, then I would probably go that route and point out to him, hey, there's a logical inconsistency here between this extreme libertarianism, capitalism, but then also, Christian humanism and Christian ethics, like that, and they're not reconciling those things, and you have a disconnect, and you have to fix that. Now, a lot of the movements I think we're seeing today with the resurgence of Marxism, logical incoherency doesn't matter, again, because they don't even value truth as something in things. And so, like with the gender ideology stuff, a lot of them, they can't really talk a lot about it because logically it's not coherent, but that doesn't matter to them. I was also reading this book about Pope Pius XII and the Nazis recently, and it was talking about in Nazism, they kind of follow the path of Nietzsche, rejecting reason and believe that they should follow the intuition from their Aryan blood. That's what truth was to them. So you could logically tell them, hey, no, what you're saying is wrong, and here's why, X, Y, or Z. But that doesn't matter, because truth is that intuition they've received from their heritage, something different. So yeah, I mean, you kind of have to identify that sort of fundamental premise before you can go anywhere, I guess I'd say.
More work to do. Christopher.
Yeah, I was I'm interested in what you said about the worldview today. I mean, what they call postmodernism. It seems to me the assumption behind postmodernism is that all truth claims are merely power claims. Mm-hmm. And that's something that is it seems almost insurmountable in terms of conversation, right? I mean, where do you begin with someone who makes that claim? And because it seems like they've shut themselves off completely right from the beginning to any kind of pursuit of truth.
Right. And one of the ways maybe I'd go about it is to try to show the absurdity of where those beliefs lead to. Like materialism, if you're logically consistent, how can you say that social Darwinism is wrong? A lot of people today, it's unpalatable for them, and so they try to say, well, it's obvious it's wrong, it's obvious. But is it? If you're truly a materialist, you don't believe that things have metaphysical identity. Everything is the survival of the fittest, okay, and this progress, which doesn't care about Christian ethics or humanism. How is social Darwinism wrong? And I don't think they probably would like to admit that, but there's some absurdities when you accept some of these premises. I don't know. What do you think?
Well, yeah, I mean, yeah, it's absurd, but I'm going to be a postmodernist. I'm going to say, well, it doesn't matter whether I can explain it. What I favor is what's good for me and mine. That's what I think we're coming down to that point where that's with like abortion. It doesn't really matter whether it's a human life or not. It's what works for the woman, right? What works for my race, my socioeconomic group. Social Darwinism is bad for me, so I'm opposed to it. I think that's really. I don't know if they would always explain it that starkly, but I think that's what is actually lies behind it. And
yeah, and so I guess I would argue to that. You can try to socially engineer humanity. You can try to mold things into this new image where there is no objective truth. Everything's just power. But I think at the end of the day, you're going to end up with the 20th century. You're going to end up with these horrors because you're trying to act as though these truths aren't real, but they are real. And so you have to impose this new ideology by force and by manipulation and by genocide and by dividing people and by causing strife and by all these different horrible things. And so I guess I would argue at the end of the day, you can live like this for a while, but you're going to end up collapsing some of the structures that make society livable. And hopefully the next generation will come with a fresh mind and be able to see, hey, we have to return to something like, yeah, everybody has equal dignity. So, yeah, what do you respond?
yeah, I guess it's you could say that, but I don't think they'll see it because they'll say, well, we'll establish things like compassion, and I just got done reading Aldous Huxley's last novel, Island. I don't know if it's all just Buddhism or some quasi kind of Buddhism, but that's what he basically establishes. This island was this utopia, and so everything in it is basically based upon certain principles that he holds, and which he just develops, of course, as you can in a novel, in the best light. So yeah. And that's another thing too. Like I would wonder when you get into metaphysics, when you can start to talk about things like Buddhism, which seems to deny all dualisms, right? You're getting into metaphysics there, which seems to almost preclude reasoning, isn't it?
I'm not super knowledgeable about Buddhism, but my understanding is that they want to flee from any type of existence into kind of like a nothingness. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, that would make sense to me that they would also kind of be anti-reason as well.
Well, you see, you just have to hang out more and more New Age bookstores with crystals. Not sure you're going to get real Buddhism there, but...
gosh, this is really encouraging. Shouldn't we at some point recognize that while human nature is fundamentally good, it's been terribly undermined, and it's being undermined is oftentimes very clear in our inability to engage in sustained reasoning. And we know from the Vulgate that our enemy is tam quam leo rugiens. Pope Francis oftentimes refers to the accuser, to Satan. And it would seem to be the case that in our struggles in the public sector, in our intellectual life, that there is this decided undertow. And we shouldn't be overly surprised by it. We should be alert to it. And we should be alert to it insofar as it affects us, not just the people that we're engaged in dispute with. And again, Francis says, could be said of philosophy just as well as theology, that we need to do it on our knees, on our knees. And I think that at an intellectual level, someone like, say, Alvin Plantinga is much more compelling than someone like Daniel Dennett. Well, in the book of Daniel, what we want to do is master the traditions and the insights and the things that are good in whatever our cultural context is, even if it's the cultural context of Babylon. We want to master what there is to master, but at the same time, there's nothing wrong with our recognizing that we move forward with a certain fear and trembling. And not everything is going to come out neat, and not every insight can we formalize, which isn't to say that we shouldn't always try to love God with our whole heart, our whole soul, and our whole mind, And there's no surprise that we can't put this all together ourselves. That's why we have the infused virtues. They're infused for a reason. Very good reason that they're infused. Interestingly enough, going back to Mario and the libertarians in Latin America, I had an occasion to be in a debate a couple of days ago that was coordinated by the Libertarian Party in the United States, most particularly in California. And there's a new chair of the National Committee of the Libertarian Party named Angela McArdle. Now, here's something interesting. I like interesting factoids. Where did Angela McArdle do her undergraduate work? At Biola University. Now, Christopher knows, I think, about Biola. Biola is short for Bible College of Los Angeles. Bible College of Los Angeles. So in terms of mixed pedigrees, here's someone who's the new chair of the Libertarian Party and a graduate of Biola University. And I asked her how she liked it, and she said she liked it very much. She liked it very much. She didn't say anything particularly outrageous, but she did emphasize that as the party of principle, that's how libertarians refer to themselves, as the party of principle. The liberty of the individual is always paramount, always paramount. And so in a debate of that sort, you can kind of bounce around from the need for water rationing in Southern California. We desperately need it, although in April our use of water actually went up by 17%. Tell everybody there's a drought. well, they're going to hog as much water as they can. So you might be bouncing around from the fundamentals of human anthropology to what would be in keeping with liberty and living in a drought. And you really got to move around a lot. So I think, Stephen, writing the kind of book you have written helps us to move around a lot.
Yeah, I tried to well, first to help myself understand the 20th century and where we are now in the 21st century. But I also find, like Aristotle said, when you get to those first causes and ultimate principles, okay, you're getting towards wisdom. You're able to explain everything else that's lesser than them. And so that's kind of what I found the idea of worldview was. It's like, let me try to go as deep as possible in explaining why things happen in the 20th century. And this is kind of where I ended up with this, exploring this idea.
What?
Mario, you're poised.
I have a, I don't know if a comment, a rant, but it seems,
you're teasing us now with a rant. Go for it, dude.
It seems to me that everything begins with the senses. Whether you deny reality or you affirm, but ultimately it begins with the senses. Now, how many people realize that? When you look at the beginning of anyone's view of the world, there is always a way of educating that person. In other words, you can find people today who are agnostic, and then you look back and see how that person was educated. And in many ways, that explains much of his or her worldview.
Yeah.
So it seems deep down, we need to get to what type of education really is the one who shape this way of contemplating reality so that we don't stop in the physical world, rather we move up to the metaphysical world. That, I think, and I don't want to insist on Ortega. Ortega said this clearly. Yo soy yo y mi circunstancia. I am who I am because my circumstances. And my circumstances either shape me or destroy me. In other words, it seems to me that at the beginning, there is something crucial with education. And education is liberal education in the classical sense.
Yeah.
The tribune, the quadribune. Now, without that, good luck. And you have there examples everywhere with the so-called, non-confessional education or laicite, all that around the world.
Yeah, I think that's incredibly important. And that's why I think if you look at a lot of these ideologies, Nazism, communism, whatever, gender ideology, how do they impose themselves? How do they get people to think like that? I would argue they realize that it's education, and they begin when these kids are young, I would say indoctrinating them into these ideas about how to view the world. What is the meaning of everything? What is your identity? Where do things come from? And thereby setting them into this worldview on this track. I think it absolutely goes back to education. And that's what's the difference between propaganda and education? Well, I think, like you said, true education gets you to look at the world with an open mind, thinking logically, thinking rationally, exploring different ideas. Okay, but trying to find that which conforms to what is true. Indoctrination, I would say, is trying to take one idea and force it on somebody so deeply that they can only look at the world through that one idea. Okay, for example, everything is a struggle between the rich and the poor. All right. If I tell you that from when you're little, you're going to grow up and you're going to be reading Charles Dickens through a communist worldview. You're going to be looking at this through a communist worldview. Or if I tell you everything is, men oppressing women, okay, you're going to look at everything through that lens. Okay. So ideology, and Ortega does say this, is when you have an incomplete worldview that's imposed on somebody rather than them coming to it as a truth that they want and they need. We want narratives, and when we all have that sense, we find something true, like it's exciting. We see its conformity with reality, and so we adopt it. But that's different than like indoctrinating someone with propaganda from when they're 3 years old.
Christopher?
Don't we all sort of do that with children in education? I mean, we don't just encourage free inquiry. We actually try to inculcate in them certain worldview, don't we? I mean, I'm not saying we're just like communists, but I mean, how does it differ? Why is what we do or have been doing traditionally good, and what the communist does is bad?
That's a good point. Yeah, that's a good observation. All worldviews are based on some type of faith. Okay, so what's the difference between indoctrinating and authentically educating? And that's where I would go to, again, the idea of truth. Are we teaching them to engage with reality as it is? Or are we rewriting a history to tell them, wait, history is actually explained by this one thing? And then secondly, when it comes to claims like what religious faith do you believe in, I would argue, how does it match with what we know philosophically, right? If we know certain truths philosophically, does that faith correspond with them or elevate them, or are they at odds with one another? And so I would say if they're at odds with what we know more clearly, like these philosophical principles, then you're getting more towards the realm of having to indoctrinate rather than teach. I don't know. Does that make sense somewhat?
Yeah. It's the difficulty, of course, is with the Catholic faith, for instance. St. Thomas says that we're more certain of truths of revelation than we are of the truths of nature. And sometimes what we think are conclusions drawn from reason are not really conclusions drawn from reason, and they might contradict what the faith says, but the faith is actually right? So as Catholics, we do, at a certain point, we'll say, I might think this, but the church teaches otherwise, and therefore I submit my will and my intellect to the church. Sure. That seems different than indoctrination, but it's. I mean, somebody could look at that and say, "Well, that's just the ultimate indoctrination. You're just enslaving your mind to this institution to think what it tells you to think."
I guess if you want to put it in those terms, you could say everything is indoctrination. But as a parent, I want to try to indoctrinate you with the most correct indoctrination.
Right. Well, yeah.
As far as I can tell.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with you. I think, like, I write history, and as a Catholic, I write history. I have certain ways of looking at I have what they might call biases. I recognize that, but I strive to work against what those biases are. I try to tell the story as it actually happened, and challenge myself by reading things which are challenging to what I think might be the case.
Right.
And often coming up with accounts which are not necessarily complementary, say, to the course of the Catholic faith history. I think that's one way, one way of doing it. Not holding myself as an example necessarily of this, but I think another way of doing it is, as a lot of Catholic history has been written, is simply to say, well, I want the Catholic Church to look. One fellow told me this. He says, the other side is so insistent on making us look bad. I'm going to be insistent on making us look good. And I think that's just perverse.
Right. Yeah. Geography. Yeah.
So that, I mean, I think the Catholic faith actually does encourage us to look at even the faith critically. I mean, we don't question certain things, obviously, but we're not bound by. There are certain truths we have to uphold, but there's a whole lot of deal of liberty in terms of how to study and how to approach these things.
Yeah, and I think for most Catholic moral teaching, at least, you could make a natural law argument. Now, maybe somebody might argue, well, even though it's a reasonable argument, you are only led to understand that because of Christian revelation.
Mm-hmm.
I can sympathize with that, but I still think, nevertheless, there's definitely a core of natural law moral truth which, transcends Christian thought or modern thought or different countries and cultures. So,
yeah, I mean, I think that last point is good because it is certainly true that we come to certain moral teachings, and not that they can't be known by reason or be discovered by reason, but they're very difficult to know or be discovered by reason.
right,
I mean,
yeah.
I think kind of a blanket example is abortion. I think you can argue that abortion is unnatural, but the strange thing is that most human societies, if not all human societies except the Christian, have always allowed some kind of infanticide and abortion, right?
Right.
I think it's difficult. It's extremely difficult, maybe almost impossible for fallen mind and living in a world of uncertainty to see that some things like abortion are immoral. It's so we need the faith to actually clarify certain moral truths, it seems to me at least, and then we have to be assiduous in our attempts to try to understand what the faith teaches as a natural truth by using natural reason.
Yeah, certainly makes it easier. Yeah, to have that faith guiding reason.
Right.
Let me toss in 3 thoughts, and then I think Mario's probably watching the clock. We're probably getting fairly close to the end. Thought number 1, with regard to being educated in the right community, and of course, telling the truth about that community. We have the Old Testament. That's what we Christians are educated in, educated by, and the truth can be bleak. The truth is told about the people of God before the coming of Christ. And there's no mythologizing, there's no glossing over how terribly broken the people of God were in anticipation of the coming of Jesus. That's one thought. That's our first community, our go-to community. Another thought, fast forward. The woman whose name is Mary, and I want to say McAnee, but I don't think that's right, was the premier political figure in Ireland, and who recently completed a doctorate at one of the Roman universities. Wrote her dissertation on the injustice of baptizing the young, because that would bring any number of obligations upon them for the whole of their lives, to which they did not give knowing assent. So when we go fast forward, we go fast backward to the Anabaptists. It's really quite strange. And then we have, and this is the last little fragment of thought. Here I am walking down to the corner, and I go by a bus stop, and the bus stop always has an advertising board behind it. And it's usually of some new movie, and the movie is always recommended. And this particular movie, saw this maybe 2-3 days ago, is transcendent, gets under your skin. So It transcends the context in which you find yourself, and it gets under your skin. Talk about caught in a loop. Steady work, that's what we've got, steady work. Mario, concluding thoughts?
Well, I don't know. I think it comes down to education. That's my view, and it's not easy in this juncture in the 21st century. I think the battle is about education and the family. It all begins there. And if that battle is lost, you cannot gain anything in politics. It's good because you're not going to have people who really propose anything because they haven't learned much. Mm-hmm. And so we are engaged sometimes, and we trust politics and change the constitution. We make amendment here and there, but the foundation is cracking. That's my hopeful, not that hopeful conclusion.
Stephen, Mario's just authored a book that he claims he's going to send to us called Philosophy in a Mysterious Time.
Okay.
And I predict that there's going to be volume 2 as things get more mysterious.
Let me just comment. Indeed, I have a book which is going to come out in August, probably. And there is a quote at the beginning of the book. It's about the book, the title is In Search of Republicanism in the context of Latin America in general, which has a very specific connotation and so on. But there is a quote written by one of the most important, I think, scholar. He was a jurist in Latin America, 19th century. He was a classical liberal to some extent, but still carried over his shoulder a classical education. And he was a Catholic. And he proposed human freedom, all that, but at the same time, he emphasized so strongly, not only on education and liberal education, but the family. And he said clearly, if we don't focus this, everything will fall apart. No constitution. By the way, he is the author of the Constitution of Argentina, the Constitution, which was copy, paste, and copy everywhere. Now, this idea today is criticized by those who happen to be his followers, libertarian, liberals, and so on. So they undermine their own roots. And I think that's coming from someone who is not a Thomist, tell everything about the political order. That's it.
Thank you. Stephen, we always end with the gospel for today. And this is a short gospel from Matthew. Jesus said to his disciples, "Do not think that I have come to abolish the law or the prophets. I have not come to abolish, but to fulfill. Amen, I say to you, until heaven and earth pass away, not the smallest letter or the smallest part of a letter will pass from the law until all things have taken place. Therefore, whoever breaks one of the least of these commandments and teaches others to do so will be called least in the kingdom of heaven. But whoever obeys and teaches these commandments will be called greatest in the kingdom of heaven. Come, Lord Jesus, come. Thank you all so very much.
Thank you
so
very
for
much.
having me. It's been great to meet you guys.
Wow.
Me too.
Just wait till our thoughts get crystallized.
Keep working.
Thank you. Yeah, I'd love to sit down and have coffee with you guys sometime. That would be a lot of fun.
Okay. Take care.
All right. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Hello, God's beloved. I'm Annabelle Mosley, author, professor of theology, and host of Then Sings My Soul and Destination Sainthood on WCAT Radio. I invite you to listen in and find inspiration along this sacred journey we're traveling together to make our lives a masterpiece and, with God's grace, become saints. Join me, Annabelle Mosley, for Then Sings My Soul and Destination Sainthood on WCAT Radio. God bless you. Remember, you're never alone. God is always with you.
Thank you for listening to a production of WCAT Radio. Please join us in our mission of evangelization. And don't forget, love lifts up when knowledge takes flight.